The Glendale Road Church of Christ proudly presents a weekly exploration of the Word of our living God. This is It Is Written with Minister Stephen Hunter.
Oh, let the ancient words impart.
I want to show y'all where I grew up, mainly because where I grew up was a prepared place of sorts, and it really helps me correlate to the lesson, if you will. This is a picture from the hill, one of the hills on the family farm down in Goodlettsville, Tennessee. You can see down there is a little black fence. It's where Daddy would train with and work with his horses. And the flat fields that you see, that's about all the flat land we had. Got about close to 70 to 80 acres of a family farm, and that's it as far as flat field goes. So when they farmed it, we had a lot of livestock, a lot of cattle and horses. And when my daddy was younger, they had pigs as well. When I was a boy, if you're seeing that black fence, if you look to the left of it on the flat ground, you'll see kind of a drop off, and that's a creek or a crick, if you prefer. And we would have upwards of 400 to 500 chicken pens there and on the other side of the creek where we'd raise them. But where that fence is that the horses were in, and you see there's a barn there to the right of that fence, that's stables for the horses. But across the street, if I still lived in Tennessee, that's likely where my house would be right now, even though it's just woods. But if you're standing in front of that fence, you look to the right, and you see there's a house back behind the trees. That's Uncle Andy's house. He and his wife and children live there, my aunt and cousins. And the hill to the right of that, we used to ride horses up on that hill. And you could set a tree stand up there. Now, Granddaddy wouldn't let anybody hunt on the farm. He liked to watch deer, but if you wanted to hunt, you had to find somebody else's farm to hunt on, which I always thought was kind of an interesting paradox, but that's how he wanted it. And so anyway, you could go up there, and Daddy had a tree stand up on that hill to the right, and he just liked to go up there early of a morning and just sit in his tree stand and just watch the deer. So real pretty area. And that little red tin roof house, that's the house I grew up in. It's probably about 1,000 square feet or so, and you think, man, that's a small house. Well, when you had as much land as we had to roam and play on, the only time you were in the house was really to clean up and to eat and sleep. That's about it. And sometimes you'd eat on the front porch, or you'd eat at Bo and Lisa's house, Aunt and Uncle's house down the way. You didn't spend much time in the house because there's plenty to do outside. Now here's what you can't see because it's not there. But going up and down that driveway, there were barbed wire fences that went up and down that driveway that lined the roads and went around all the area. When I talk about cleaning fence rows, that's the fence rows that I would have to clean. And wouldn't you know, after I move out, they tear those fences down and get rid of all the livestock. They lost their fence row cleaner, so they said, I think we're just going to sell all the cattle and just take down the fences. And I go, and that's very nice of you, thanks. So, but the hill to the left of the house, at the top of that hill, I don't think you can see it because it's good in camouflage, but that's where Graham and Granddaddy lived. Their house is up at the top of that hill. Granddaddy could walk out on his front deck and he could look down. He could see our house. He could see Uncle Bo and Aunt Lisa's house, and just, he had a bird's eye view of the living quarters of the farm. So you keep going left, and of course there are more hills, and there's the horse stables, and farther to the left you've got Uncle Bo and Aunt Lisa's house. You might can see the red tin roof to the far left. But boy, my cousins and I, we'd get out in that field, and here's what we'd do. Now this is going to sound gross, but when your kid's growing up around livestock, there's not a lot that's gross, really. We'd take the dry cow patties, and we'd have a war. And we'd take those things, we'd pick them up, and we'd heave them at each other. But we always had the rule, don't touch the ones that are steaming. Leave those alone. Chad, who was a younger cousin, Brandy, my cousin, she's a year younger than I am, and Chad's a few years younger than us. Chad got a hold of one of those steaming ones one time, and when he threw, it just fell apart. So we said, let's stay away from the steaming ones because they don't hold and heave too well. They just kind of and plus you stink afterwards. So, but the dry ones, they're okay. And so we have a lot of fun out there. We'd ride the horse in the field if you didn't want to go trail riding. And it was always good fun. Keep going. There's just another picture of the same area of the hill back there. And here we go, and you're seeing to the left, and just more views, and it's very hilly. Now, if you see kind of in the center, those trees way off back yonder, as we'd say. Over there, we had an inclined field. That's where we dove hunt. We had Uncle Bo would plant some corn on the side of that field and just kind of, we want to make sure the doves were well fed and they knew to keep coming back there. And then after season, of course, that'd all be tore down and the tractor would have gone and cleaned a lot of that stuff up. But when it was dove season, we'd sit right over there. Now, you may think I'm lying, but we had TVA power lines that go right across that area. And so a lot of the doves, they just land on the power lines over that field. That's no joke. With a .410 Winchester, I could shoot a dove off power lines. And for you animal rights people, I'm sorry, but we'd dove hunt and we'd eat them, But it was always a big family affair and fun and a lot of good stuff. There you see Stephanie walking up. I'm probably in trouble. She's walking with a purpose. But that house with the red tin roof, that was the house that belonged to that farm built in 1920s. Graham and Granddaddy bought it somewhere around the 60s, I think it was. And that's where my daddy and his brothers all grew up in that house. And a lot's changed over the years, even since I was a kid, but there used to be a clothesline out there where Graham would hang her clothes on. That's where we go every Christmas morning for Christmas breakfast. And the rule on Christmas is the men do the cooking. That's the only one day of the year that the women can have off. But it's funny how they're so used to cooking, they still want to butt in and tell us how to do things, even though this tradition has gone on for a long time. And on Christmas morning a few years ago, in this little cabin, that's where we all worship the Lord as a family. I led the singing. Everyone went deaf. My Uncle Bo and Daddy, they served the Lord's Supper. And my Uncle Andy did the preaching. And they figured, well, if the church lets you have a day off preaching, we'll let you have a day off preaching too, but you're going to lead singing. You're going to do something. Nobody gets a full day off. So that's just a big cabin that Uncle Bo built, and big open area. He had a fire going in there. It was really, really nice. And here are my granddaddy and my uncles and daddy. Starting on the left, you've got Uncle Andy. Down front, obviously, with the baseball cap, that's Granddaddy. That was nearly 10 years ago. He had cancer real bad at that time. So that's probably the thinnest I had ever recalled him being. In that black cowboy hat's Daddy, and my vertically challenged uncle up front, that's Uncle Jim. To the far right, that's Uncle Bo. Now, when you talk about a prepared place in John 14 and Jesus telling us about the prepared place for us, that farm was a prepared place for us too, my family that is. Granddaddy bought that land with the idea in mind that he wanted his children and subsequent generations, if they wanted to grow up on that farm. This was a place that when they bought it, Daddy said stuff was grown up high. It was just in an awful mess. But luckily, Granddaddy had 4 boys that he didn't mind putting to work to get the mischief out of them. And in due time, they had cleaned up a lot of that land. So I think about that, and right now there has been 4 generations to live on that farm. The first generation that bought it has passed on and gone on to the prepared place for them in heaven, whereas those that remain are still there. And so, very special piece of land for me and my family. And some of you probably have similar stories. The place where you live, maybe you've grown up on a farm that was your grandparents, great-grandparents, or however far back it was. And you inherit and you build on and you farm and you sow and you plow and you reap and you do all the things that the land is intended for. But there was somebody a long time ago, for some of us, who started with that place. And that's why we have it today. But the place that Jesus has in store for us, we who are Christians, is a place that's prepared for a purpose. The purpose isn't so much to work it. The purpose isn't so much for labor and toil. but for rest. Eternal rest where we enter into the joy of our Father's presence. But before he starts out, he says to them first and foremost, let not your hearts be troubled. And the reason their hearts would have been troubled, if you read ahead of that, Christ had announced Judas as his betrayer. In John 13, they sit around the dinner table for the Last Supper, the Passover meal that they're having, where Jesus himself gave new meaning to the Passover supper, that new meaning that we just observed a moment ago in the partaking of the Lord's Supper. And while they're sitting at that dinner, which is to be his last, instead of comforting and consoling them and telling them a lot of great things, he says, one of you will betray me. And they kind of turn around and they say, well, Lord, is it me? Lord, is it I? And they go around and he says, well, now he whoever dips his hand in the bowl with me, that's the one that will betray me. And so you could probably think at that point when they say that, everybody draws their hands back from the dinner table. I'm not going to be the one to put my hand in that bowl with the Lord. I'm not going to betray the Lord. But Judas was the one. And so this bothered them. These were Jesus' 12 most intimate friends, the apostles. And one of them would betray him, and that brought them some trouble. Secondly, Christ announced that the time for his departure was at hand. And during that departure, he would be given over to those in authority. He would be beaten, he would be crucified, and he would die. And so rather than saying, well, we have a betrayer in our midst, he says, well, the betrayer and the actions that he'll take will lead eventually to my departure. And so their hearts continue to be troubled. And then he announces, out of his 12 apostles, 3 of them were a close circle of friends, Peter, James, and John. And of that close circle of friends, one of them would deny him that very night. And it was to be Peter. So they're hearing all these things about betrayal, departure, denial. And Jesus says, after all these things, let not your hearts be troubled. How can we not? How can we not be troubled in our minds and in our hearts and in our souls when one of us will betray you and our betrayal will lead to your departure and Peter himself will even deny you? Everything they had known up to this point, Jesus is telling them, here's where the hammer drops. You think you're close to me. One of you will deny me. Peter, you have been closer to me along with James and John than the rest of the 12. But yet you this night will deny me. And Peter doesn't say, you know what, Judas, because you're going to betray me, I ought to kick you in the seat of your pants. He doesn't say, Peter, because you're going to deny me, I want you to know that I'm not going to be your friend anymore. After he tells them all this bad news, Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. The very one who's going to be betrayed, the very one who will be denied, the very one who will depart, instead of worrying about himself, he consoles others. Let not your hearts be troubled. And so you look in your Bible to the passage at what Jesus has to say. He says, you believe in God, believe also in me. Now, you go on ahead as you study this passage. There are some textual considerations we have to have. Believe is from the same word that we find translated faith throughout our Bible. And it doesn't merely mean mental assent. Oh, I believe in you. I believe that you... No, it means to trust. You trust in me, or rather, you trust in God, trust also in me. Has to do with having a relationship. You know, some of us have relationships that have been going on for a number of years. Maybe a marriage, or perhaps a good friendship. And as you go through the ups and the downs that each of the relationships bring you, if you survive them, the bond grows stronger. And for the 3 years that Jesus has ministered, which is not a very long time, mind you, but these guys have been there for a great part of that time. They have seen Jesus attacked verbally. They have seen His character misrepresented. They have seen His work cast into doubt. And they've weathered the storm with Him. And so if you trust in God, Jesus says, trust also in me. For in my Father's house there are many mansions. What's interesting about this is in John 2:16, Jesus refers to the temple as His Father's house. Now, is He saying in the temple there are many mansions? Well, that would have been true. There were many rooms in the temple literally. But the temple on earth was meant only to be a shadow of the heavenly tabernacle where God actually dwells. And so He's making this connection between, here you see the visible temple on earth, think about where God actually is, in the heavens. In my Father's house are many mansions. Now, we think about mansions today, and we think about these great gargantuous houses. Gargantuous is a fancy word for pretty big. When you go to university and pay for an education, sometimes you got to use fancy words. But mansion to us isn't the same as mansion for them. They would not have envisioned an 8,500 square foot home with 7 bathrooms and whatever else, a pool out back and all this land surrounding it. Mansion, as it was translated in the King James Bible at the time that word was used, meant resting place. It was only centuries later that mansion came to truly mean a great old big house. But to them, it would have been a place of rest, a place prepared where you can go. Think about this. Some of us go from time to time and we travel, and maybe we stay with a friend or family member. And some of us, we stay with those friends or family members. Maybe they have an extra spare bedroom in their house that's prepared for us. That's a resting place for us. Or maybe you book a hotel room for wherever you're going. That's a resting place. You go wherever you're going, and you go and you see all the sights, and you have all the fun you can have, do all the activities that you want to do. But eventually, you go back to the resting place when you're wore out and tired and you're ready to cease from all the things that are going on. And so this is how they would have understood these things. So this prepared place is a prepared place in God's house, the heavens above. And Jesus says, if it weren't so, I would have told you. But I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I'll come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may also be. In keeping with God's treatment of His people all the way back in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 1:29-33, God had prepared a place for Israel. It was a place not of wandering as they had done for the past 40 years in the wilderness. It was a place not of slavery where they had been for over 400 years in the land of Egypt, but rather it was meant to be a place of rest, the land of Canaan that they were to go in and inhabit, driving out all of those who live there. And so God had a prepared place for Israel. And one of the things, if you look in your Bibles to John 11, the Jews feared losing their home. What the Jews fear is that because Jesus is teaching what He is teaching, eventually they would be conquered by the Romans and they would be driven out of their homes as a result of Jesus' teaching. And so they were afraid of losing this very home that God had given to them. But what they failed to keep in mind was the fact that it was a home God had given, not meant to be an eternal dwelling. Some of the songs that we sang this morning, here we are but straying pilgrims. Think about this. Now, I look back at the farm in Goodlettsville, Tennessee and go, that's my home. That's where I was brought up. And when I think of home, that's where I think of. And some of you, when you think of home, you have ideas about what home is too. But here's the reality. As we sing, this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. Right? And so the prepared place that God has for His people is depicted here as an abundance of living accommodations, a place where we rest, a place where we cease from all labors. As you think about, as I have over the past couple of weeks, I can't help but get out of my mind the horrible tragedy that took place in Marshall County, something that many of you have been touched by. I've tried not to talk too much about it because I don't want you to think I'm on a hobby horse, or I don't want to wear anybody out by it. But I told Stephanie, we were having a conversation yesterday. I said, that week I was thinking, boy, it'd sure be fine with me if the Lord were to come now. I'd be all right with it. And I said, now I usually don't pray that prayer, mainly because there are others who I know if He were to come, I don't think they'd have that eternal home. But I said, it'd be just fine by me if I were to go be with the Lord. Because you look at how ugly this world is. Children shouldn't have to fear going to school. People shouldn't have to fear going to church. It's a sad reality that we have to have a security apparatus in place in the event that someone would ever want to come into a house of worship and wreak 9 kinds of havoc. So what next? Where will this world keep going? Now, we could sit and talk over a McDonald's biscuit and a cup of coffee, and we could say, well, here's what needs to happen. And we may have the right answers. But what we need is just to be the people of change that we want to see. It's not enough to sit around and bellyache over the ugly in our society when we as Christians can be the beauty in this earth. People need to see in us the love of Christ. People need to see in us the compassion of Christ. People need to see in us the good of Christ. Not that we fake it to convince people otherwise, but that we live as a gospel-centered people who can say honestly, no matter how bad it gets here, this is not my eternal home. I have a place prepared in the heavens by Jesus Christ Himself. The son of a carpenter here on earth puts his skills to use in the kingdom of heaven, there fashioning for me a prepared place. But brethren, I tell you this, that prepared place is meant for prepared people. God's not going to force anybody to go there that doesn't want to go there. He's not going to drag us to that prepared place, but gives Himself to us in His love and grace. And He says, I promise there is somewhere better. Are you prepared? If not, make ready. Come to the front and let us know your needs as we stand and sing.
Holy words,
This has been It Is Written, presented by the Glendale Road Church of Christ. We welcome your visits and communications at any time.
sound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart.